Congresswoman Grace Meng's career has been led with one mission in mind: justice. That's why this Asian American and Pacific Islander month, I am honored and delighted to introduce Congresswoman Meng, a trailblazer, a female leader, and a fierce advocate for justice as our keynote speaker today. After her opening remarks, Representative Meng will sit in conversation with our own Dr. Susan Kang, Associate Professor of Political Science. Her research and areas of expertise include human rights, trade unions, international law, and voting rights. And my fellow student, Joey Ning, an international criminal justice and gender studies major and a Macaulay Honors student, will assist during the Q&A period of the program. Thank you all for joining us today, and we will now proceed with the discussion. Take it away, Professor Kang.
Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Susan Kang, and thank you again, Congresswoman Meng, for coming today. And let's get started with the questions. Okay, so my first question is, can you please share how your heritage, identity, and educational and personal experiences have led you down the path of public service and politics? How do these experiences from your perceptions and inspire the work you do and the issues you pursue?
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank John Jay College, Professor Kang, Jennifer, Mindy, and all the students, especially, for inviting me here today. It's such a privilege for me to be in this space with you, and really thankful for John Jay providing us this opportunity to have this discussion during APA Heritage Month. Just a little bit background about myself. I was born and raised in Queens, New York. My parents were immigrants to this country in the early 70s. My grandma was actually the first one to come to this country. She worked as a housekeeper for most of her adult life here in the US. And then my parents came, and our family slowly immigrated, mostly to Queens, New York. My parents worked in a restaurant for most of my childhood, and later on became small business owners, restaurant owners themselves. So, my background is probably similar to a lot of immigrant community stories from regardless of where around the globe you first came from. I will say that growing up as a kid in Queens, I never thought that I would go into politics. It was never on my radar. I never ran for student government. I never even took a political science class in college. I was a really shy kid. Like, I was that shy kid that would try to sit in the back of the room. I would try to disappear in class if that was even possible. And I knew that I wanted to, through college and law school, I knew that I wanted to do something related to public interest law, whatever I thought that meant at the time. After law school, I started a local nonprofit, just working with some friends, and we would each volunteer our time a few days a week to literally help senior citizens and immigrants in our community, translate their mail or help them make phone calls. Nothing necessarily that you needed expertise on, and probably a lot of skills that I, as many, learned as a kid of immigrant families growing up. Fast forward a little bit, I had the opportunity to run for the New York State Assembly. I didn't make it my first time. I tried again. I was there for a few years, and then later had the opportunity to run for Congress. I thought it was really important, not necessarily wanting to run myself at the time, but when, it was a very sudden opportunity. And I thought that it was important that the voices of the Asian American community were at least being heard in terms of who we were electing and the issues that they might focus on. So long story short, here I am.
You make it sound pretty easy, so kudos to you. Could you please share some of the discriminatory experiences you have faced as you developed in your career and how you handled those situations? What advice do you have for our students as they embark upon their career journeys during such trying times, the global pandemic, the surge of Asian hate crimes, racial justice movements, and most recently, the deplorable anti-Asian violence witnessed through the shootings in Atlanta?
I will tell you that my answer, if you asked me this question maybe even a year or two ago, it might have been different. I think in witnessing so many of the incidents that have happened to people in our community throughout the last year, especially in recent months, to our elderly, to our most vulnerable, and especially after the murders that happened in Atlanta, I really, at this late stage of my life, kind of had an awakening of my own. As an Asian American kid growing up in Queens, Queens wasn't always as diverse in some areas as it might be today, not even as diverse as it should be. But there were often times when I was a kid when I was like the only Asian in class, or maybe one of two. And I really, in hindsight, have thought a lot about this over the last few weeks, and really felt that as an Asian kid, I was really really playing defense for most of my childhood, trying to make sure that I fit in and that I was viewed as American enough, always feeling like I was the odd one out. I remembered and told for the first time in the last few weeks a story that I kind of suddenly remembered as a kid. I remember my school had an open house where parents were able to come and watch their kids in class and play. And my dad came in his chef's outfit because he worked in a restaurant, all white outfit. And I was so embarrassed. I was thinking to myself, why can't my dad dress like the other parents who are in suits or dresses or whatnot? And that to me really just popped up in my mind over the last few weeks, that my whole life I was sort of trying to play defense. And whenever people said things to me, and many of us have probably experienced these sorts of what people say to us, like people making fun of our facial features, or people making fun of our cultures and our traditions and our food, people asking, where I learned to speak English, and people telling me to go back. And the incidents that happened to me weren't necessarily anything that put me in physical, harm's way. But I really realized in recent months that I think internalized and compartmentalized a lot of that. And sometimes I spoke back and sometimes I didn't speak up. And the few times that I did, I would be told, I'm just joking. Like, can't you take a joke? And so, I never felt like my life was in any, real harm, but I really sort of kind of didn't talk about it as much, all these things that happened as a kid. And so now as I'm growing up, and talking to many of you who are kind of growing up in this age, I want to share with you what I wish that I had felt and thought when I was younger. Again, I was telling you, I was always playing defense, and I want you all to be proud of your identity, be proud of who you are, and be confident, right? Like, you don't have to be on the defense about who you are. Be proactive. You are, be on the offense. Your stories are just as American as anyone else's. And I never fully appreciated that as a kid. And recently, when I went to Atlanta to meet with some of the families of the victims, I literally said that to their families. I said, I didn't know your mom, but I know that your mom sacrificed so much for your families. And because of your mom, I met with two of the families. Because of your moms, we feel as Asian Americans that we finally have a voice, that we are able to, in a much more effective way, talk about the intersectionality of racism, misogyny, and how Asian women in particularly have been viewed by American society. And I thank them for giving the Asian American community a voice and allowing us to realize more so that we don't have to be on the defense about how we fit into this country anymore. And so, this is sort of what a lot of what people say Asians have been silent. Not necessarily. People haven't listened to us. A lot of us have been screaming out at various levels for so long, but people just choose not to hear us. So I want to encourage all of you, just by you being on this call today is so empowering for me, and I hope for you too. and just to understand the value that you bring into a room, into a discussion, and people need to hear your voices.
Thank you for that. So prior to being elected to the House of Representatives, you served in the New York State Legislature from 2009 to 2012. What was that experience like, being the only Asian American in the state legislature, and how did that experience prepare you to serve in Congress?
Gosh, so I was the only one, and I like to share stories with my two other colleagues in the state assembly now as well. There's more than one Asian, Yulene from Manhattan and Ron Kim from Queens. Yulene jokes about being confused for me, even though we were there at completely separate times. And, you know, Ron Kim has had his share of interesting comments made towards him. I remember when I first got there, we were a bunch of colleagues, we were watching something on TV. We were watching the news or something, and like it was coverage of some fight that broke out somewhere. And one of my colleagues turned to me and he said, well, Grace Meng knows karate. She'll be able to protect us, right? Like I never even met this guy before. I was new on the job. And then, you know, another night we were getting ready to go out to dinner, and we were sort of splitting up into three groups, three different restaurants. And I happened to choose the group that was going to get Chinese food. And another colleague said, well, I understand you have to, you know, support your people, right? So it's a lot of those comments, which, you know, when I speak up, they're like, I'm just joking, right? Can't you take a joke? But also recognizing that it's important that we are there, not just for purposes of symbolism, that we are there as an Asian American, but also for the voices that we are bringing to the table. You know, like two bills that I introduced at the time. One was to make Asian Lunar New Year a school holiday, which was just symbolic, but I thought was important to recognize our community. And the second was for more disaggregated data on how the state collected and categorized statistics on so many issues, but especially for healthcare, that our needs weren't really being kept track of or even addressed in some ways. And so these two pieces of legislation, it was kind of novel, right? I had to explain to a lot of people what their purpose was, what they meant, how that would help my community. And a lot of times, you know, even as a Democrat, when people are talking about various communities, Asian Americans are often left out. So they'll talk about so many different other communities and constituencies, but literally will leave out Asian Pacific Americans. And so, you know, it's important for us to be there to raise the voices. But I will tell you that one thing, I'll end on this, one thing that I learned that was really helpful was, so I was the only Asian American there. Obviously, I couldn't even have my own Asian caucus, right? Like in legislative bodies, we call them caucuses, kind of like what clubs, or, you know, I guess that's what you call them in your school. So we call them caucuses. I couldn't even have my own because I was the only one. And so my colleagues invited me to join what they created as the Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian caucus, right? And at first, you know, I realized, I said, you know, our interests are kind of different. But then I realized after, you know, a very short time that our community has benefited from so much of the struggles and achievements made by the Black and Latino communities. And that so many of our issues, we have so much more in common than we do have, you know, different and separate from each other. And when we band together, we are stronger. And so I want to encourage you to find these alliances and to strengthen solidarity between different community groups in your academic life as well.
Just very quickly before I move on, just want to say thank you for all the work you did in the state in your early career. And those are things, as I'm somebody, as an Asian woman in my 40s, I'm starting to hit that pre-diabetic zone that regular doctors don't understand and have to explain to them. Our bodies are different. You need to disaggregate data. So thank you so much. As vice chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, you are the prime sponsor of legislation to combat Asian hate, especially given the current discourse in our country. Can you please talk about this effort and your legislation? A bill passed in the Senate almost unanimously. How are you engaging your colleagues on both sides of the aisle?
Sure. Well, first I want to give credit to Senator Hirono, who is the sponsor of the bill on the Senate side, and Senator Chuck Schumer, our New York Senator, who was very instrumental in getting the bill passed. We hope to get it passed on the House side in the next few weeks. This legislation does a couple of things. It would provide funding to local community groups who have really been on the forefront of protecting our community members and doing the job that government should have been doing during this COVID time. Even at the beginning, whether it's the federal government or the state or the city, you know, really basic things we needed and didn't get was like translation of materials. You know, I had constituents who don't speak English who didn't even know that we were under quarantine because they're not reading mainstream newspapers, they're not watching cable news networks, right? And so in this public health crisis, when we are in the middle of a battle, we weren't providing sufficient information. So anyway, these community groups are also doing something that my bill would do, which is collect data. Hate crimes, hate incidents, crimes or not, are a public health crisis, just like gun violence is. The federal government does not have an accurate picture of where and how these incidents are happening across the country. I believe that only about 15% of hate incidents are even reported to the federal government. So if it weren't for people tweeting and collecting their own videos and disseminating that for our local community groups doing all this work, the federal government, the Department of Justice probably wouldn't fully believe or understand how bad the situations are. We also want to make it easier for people to be able to report these incidents. And I want to, say something that some people might disagree with. The goal here is not to charge more people with hate crimes or to incarcerate more people. Incarceration and prosecution for hate crimes alone is not going to solve the problem, right? And I've been trying to go around because we have a very wide spectrum of how our community is reacting to all this. Some people want more police, some people want no police. There is a wide spectrum, but the solution has to be very holistic. Addressing it from a law enforcement and reporting these incidents comes at the back end, right? And so what are we doing at the front end to protect our community members, to provide mental health support for both victims and perpetrators, to reimagine the budgets of police, of law enforcement, so that, if someone needs mental health support, that they're not just automatically calling 911. We have legislation in Congress, actually it's Representative Porter's legislation I'm helping with, where we would provide more ways for mental health experts to respond to some of these calls instead of just 911 police officers every single time. And so we want to make it easier to report, right? We need to know the data. We tell people like, oh, just go report it. But you know what? People might be scared to go to a police precinct. People might be disabled. People might literally have to go to work as, a racial slur is thrown at them or they're attacked. They don't have time to sit there to wait. So we would love for, a capability to report things online and in multiple languages. And last, this is a bill that I actually sponsored. It's law now, actually, in New York State only, a bill that would allow a judge to use counseling and education as part of sentencing if someone's convicted of a hate crime. The goal is to educate. The goal is to help break down the walls of biases and stereotypes. And so it's important that we think along those lines instead of full only prosecution. And so I also want to, talk to people. You all have a very wide reach. This is the time for us to not just talk about racism aimed at our communities, but also intolerance that exists within our own communities. We need to look at our ethnic papers. Are we reporting things accurately? Are we talking about things fairly in the context, if it's a Black or Latino perpetrator versus a white perpetrator, right? We cannot, on many Zooms and events, I am asked, what race is the perpetrator? And I said, unless you're the one looking for the perpetrator, I don't really care what race this person is, because pointing fingers at each other's communities is not constructive. It is not going to solve any problems. And the only way that we are going to get through this is through solidarity. We live in a very diverse city, but many of our communities live side by side, operating in their own silos. And this is the opportunity, right? We've marched against anti-Semitism. We've marched to say Black Lives Matter, diverse communities marching together. And now others are standing with our community to protect Asian Americans. So we have to keep thinking of ways to show solidarity and to mutually understand each other better.
Thank you so much for that answer. I thought it was wonderful. Okay, so the House has voted to safeguard voting rights, COVID relief, water infrastructure, policing changes, among other issues. Can you identify other legislative priorities we can expect next? What's in store for the infrastructure plan, investments in the social safety net, higher education, maybe immigration reform? I know there's a lot, but we're just very curious.
Sure. So I'm going to give a biased answer. My colleagues might not agree with me, but before we address any of this, we have to get rid of something called the filibuster. And we could probably have a whole nother conversation on this. But basically, it is harder to pass legislation. It takes a greater percentage of members to pass a bill on the Senate side than on the House side. Now, I'm going to get political for 1 second. Many of us worked very hard to make sure that we got more Democratic senators in the Senate and that we won back the White House. So I will not use the same excuse when my constituents ask me why we haven't passed HR 8, for example, on gun safety. I cannot, in good conscience, use the same response that I did 2 years ago when we didn't control the House, because we control, as Democrats, the Senate now. So my answer, first and foremost, is we need to get rid of this filibuster. This is just a procedural a move that if we don't eliminate this year, I believe we might only have 2 years, worst case scenario. We might not be able to pass a lot of this legislation that Dr. Kang's asking about. And so there's gun safety, immigration reform, so many issues. One thing that is coming up that people are talking about a lot right now, you'll hear about 2 major bills. They're called the American Families Plan and the American Jobs Plan. So this is an instance where we want to hold the president accountable to a slogan he uses quite often, which is build back better. Building back means that we can't just build back to what our communities look like the day before COVID started, right? Think back to January 2020. In retrospect, in hindsight, our society was not perfect. There were lots of inequities. I'm also biased because I come from Queens, where we lost more people to COVID than any other borough, any other county in this city. We have less hospital beds per person than any other county in this city. So we were already on unequal footing. So for my purposes, we have to not just build back, but we have to build back better. That means not just building roads, bridges, and highways and potholes, which of course are important, but how are we reimagining and recreating our infrastructures? We talk about green climate and climate change. Our young people have taught us so much about the importance of saving the planet for them. So how are we building back better, trying to work between labor unions, making sure that we are rebuilding our infrastructure in a way that preserves and saves our community? We can do this with electric buses. We can do this by, using more solar panels. We can do this by revamping the infrastructure for our schools, for public housing, so many areas that we can easily start with that is under the jurisdiction of the federal government. I'm also saying that as a mom, it is important that we reinvest in our childcare industry. My colleague, Congressman Bowman, has a resolution that talks about the care economy, the care infrastructure. This is not something that we have prioritized in this country. For Mother's Day, you've heard it a few times in the past few days. We don't want just flowers anymore. After this COVID pandemic, we have realized that we have gone backwards. We have regressed on decades of progress, lost in 1 year, where we saw over 5 million women lose their job, over 1.5 million moms have left the workforce. So we need to reinvest to make sure that there are actually women and people who have jobs to take those roads, bridges, and highways. And so those are some of the higher education I'm trying to think. So, you know, I like President Biden's plan about free college to a certain extent for Americans, but we also have to grapple with the high debt that so many young people face right now. They're unable to be able to buy homes. They're unable to start their families because they have this crippling debt. And that's something that we can use this opportunity. He has the opportunity to cancel student debt like today. And so these are things that we fought for in the elections. These are priorities that Americans of all backgrounds in red and blue and purple districts can all agree on. And I'll end with, water infrastructure. You know, water infrastructure and affordable broadband access, it is horrific to me that in the United States of America, we have families, including right here in New York State, who have lead in the water. Queens parks have more lead in the water than any other county as well. And why our schools, our parks have lead, old lead pipes that our children aren't able to drink from. And as we talk about affordable internet access, before COVID began, 12 million students had no access to the internet sitting in the parking lots of a fast food restaurant. That's the United States of America. So when we talk about infrastructure, you know, we need to talk about those issues too.
Okay, so just very quickly, if you could in just 2 minutes. Actually, no, I'm gonna let this go to the student question now because we've gotten such wonderful answers from you. I really appreciate them all. And now it's time for the student to speak. So Joey?
All right. Hi, Congresswoman Meng. Thank you so much for your answers. So you talked about this briefly earlier, that a lot of people are working towards Asian representation and helping the AAPI community. However, as an Asian American myself, I'm in your I'm within your constituency. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that even though a lot of work is being done, our reputation as being quiet and docile has preceded us. So what can we do to encourage the Asian American community to engage more within the political system and the arena? And how can we overcome our own cultural barriers and our reputation for silence and docility?
That's a great question. So I think our communities and many communities really went through or are beginning to go through a form of like a transformation in this past year and a half. I first saw this happening when we saw a lot of Asian Americans participate in Black Lives Matters rallies. And then I think that many people, including myself, really had for the very first time conversations with our own family members and community leaders who were like, why were you at a Black Lives Matter protest, right? And I was happy because like our Asian media outlets covered some of this. And so I think that was sort of the opening for a lot of these conversations. A few, you know, and I try to emphasize when I'm talking to community leaders who probably don't fully understand, right? And it's on us, it's on me and you to have these conversations. Our parents and grandparents, they sacrificed pretty much their adulthood and some of their, you know, young adulthood so that you and I could have these opportunities. They don't necessarily have the time or the tools in their toolbox to be able to have these conversations and to strengthen the coalitions. And so it is very much up to us where we go from here, what we are going to do. This is our purpose, I believe, and our obligation. You know, Asian Americans, you're right, have been largely invisible from our history books to the budget books of government funding, of corporate philanthropy, of foundations in general, to what we talked about earlier, data. And I've even had pushback when I had my desegregation bill because they say, well, we don't want to break down, you know, the different Asian races and ethnicities, and it's sort of a model minority where some people in our community only want to hear and portray the good parts of our community. But you know what that means? That means people don't know that we suffer from high rates of diabetes and hepatitis. People don't know that Asian American elderly have the highest rates of suicide. And so we need them to, so when people push back on that, I say to them, don't you want our community to get the help it needs? Because if we don't have the data, if we don't present the facts, we can't get the help and the funding that we deserve. Asian Americans are 15% of this city's population. We get less than 1% of the funding from our city government, right? And so these are little things that we can ask for. There's also movements, and I like this because I feel like this is an excuse for us to work with other communities. Like in Congress right now, we're trying to, I have a bill and I'm working with other colleagues to push for more diverse curriculum to include Asian, Black, Latino, and Native American history, and so many other communities, LGBTQ, women, right? So many people's stories have been missing from the portrayal of what is truly American history. And so, you know, we've been invisible, right? And when you're invisible from all that, you're invisible from the media, people are left to their own devices sometimes to come up with what they think an Asian is, which is not American enough for a lot of people. So that's sort of my long answer. I give you a lot of homework, but we will work on this together. I'm very hopeful. I think this is a galvanizing moment for our community.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. Definitely had that reckoning at home too. And I think a lot of students are knowing that having to kind of be that call to action. And on that note, I have one last question for you, which is, what advice would you give to the next generation of leaders, specifically students of color and first generation and immigrant students? For students who are interested in a career in public service and public interest law, what are the types of opportunities, preparation, and skill sets you recommend they need to be successful?
Okay, number one is to know your worth. Don't be like me. When I grew up, I was always trying to fit in. I never felt like my Asianness was good enough or American enough. I want you guys to be proud of who you are. Know your worth, regardless of if your network is 5 people or 5,000 people, you can make a difference, right? You have the ability, literally day by day, even on your block, even in your apartment building, to help improve the lives of someone that you know. And you start small, right? It's fine. You're making a difference. The second, in the lines of solidarity, and this was something said by the national NAAC president. He said to be a friend before you need a friend. That's something that we have to teach our community too, right? Sometimes people don't like seeing us younger, I'm gonna pretend I'm near your age, younger Asian Americans speaking up so much, getting so involved. You know, we were told, just mind your own business, keep quiet, don't draw attention onto yourself. And that's something that I've been trying to say, you know, be a friend before you need a friend, right? Try to understand each other's histories and pain and stories. And so lastly, mentorship. You have to do a better job than I did when I was growing up. I was so shy. I never spoke up. I never asked a question. I could have met the president of the United States sitting across the table from me, and I probably wouldn't have asked questions because I was so shy. But every person you meet, you can learn something from everyone. Make sure you're asking questions. Make sure you're doing that extra work. Study up on their bio before you walk into that room, right? You do a little extra work. So in case you're shy, now what I started to do when I got into politics, I would, you know, on a piece of paper, like write down, you know, 3 things that I noticed or questions that I had. And I would prepare ahead of time because I was that shy person in the room. I might not feel comfortable just raising my hand in a room, but if I prepared ahead of time, I would feel a little more confident and prepared to be able to ask those questions. So just the concept of mentorship too, right? Like you need to make sure that you're reaching out to those who come after you, behind you, so that you are sharing, you know, don't underestimate the knowledge and the experience that you have. It's very helpful for someone. You might be the only person that's a struggling, you know, whatever field the student's going into. You might be the only person that they feel comfortable talking to and asking advice to, and you have lots to share.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Meng, for coming and answering our questions today. Really appreciated your insights and your story. Your advice to the students also applies to me, so I'm going to take it very seriously. I believe that we have some, you have to go now, and we have some more information to share. So thank you so much again for your time while you're in session.
Thank you, Professor Kang, and thank you to everyone at John Jay. We're really proud of you, and please keep in touch. Like, this shouldn't be the last time that we have this conversation. I'm around. So be safe, everybody.